Okay, so to return to the theme that I started this lecture with, and that being that sociology is born in a time of great change. We're seeing changes in the economic order, the political realm, and the social context. And this change is taking place in the 17 and 1800s as societies move from a feudal order to an industrial one. And these pictures kind of encapsulate this change. We're moving from situations where people are largely living in these villages where they're engaging in agricultural work, so a very rural existence, and then we're moving over into these highly industrialized urban centers. And it's hard to overstate just how tremendous of a change this was, going from living like this to living like this. And a big part of sociology was trying to figure out what do these changes mean and how can we understand them. And what we're going to see is that early social thinkers and social theorists were responding to these changes and various facets of these changes. So Marx is going to focus on the issue of work. Zimmel is going to focus on this question of what does it mean to live in these large urban centers that largely didn't exist before, and related issues. Now, to help us appreciate just how tremendous and significant these changes were, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at what life was like during times of feudalism, because in my experience, this is something that most students don't have a whole lot of knowledge of. And then once we have an understanding of this, then we can talk about the changes and that occurred as we moved to an industrial society and the consequences that resulted from them. And we'll talk about those in class. And those are issues that I think we have more familiarity with. So I think the best place to start talking about feudalism is with its social and political order. And the main thing to note, and perhaps the most defining feature of feudalism, is that society was divided up into these distinct and separate orders. And these orders are what we'd refer to as status groups. And they were clearly marked and clearly defined. And at the top, you'd have the king. And the king, in theory, kind of owned and controlled everything within a particular dominion. Below the king, you had the lords. Below the lords, you had the knights, so basically the military. And then at the bottom, and this would comprise the vast majority of the population, you had peasants or serfs who are basically bound to the land. And so it wasn't only that these groups were distinct from one another, but each one also had its own set of rights and obligations in relationship to the other orders of society. So we see that the king was entitled to the loyalty of the lords. In turn, lords had the right to the military services of the knights. And then in their place, the knights had a right to rent and some product of the land that the peasants or serfs farmed. So each group has a right, but then it also has an obligation. So the peasants are obligated to farm the land for those above them. The knights are obligated to fight on behalf of the nobles or the king. And then the lords, right, they are also obligated to provide loyalty and military aid to the king if need be. So each group has distinct rights, but then also distinct obligations. And for the peasants, again, the vast majority of the population, their obligation is to pay rent and also to farm the land for those above them. They do have some rights, however. They do have a right to food if, like, say, their individual plot of land, right, is wiped out by a flood, say. Since they live in a particular dominion, right, they are entitled by the powers that be to be fed. And then also, they have a right to shelter that's going to be provided by the lords and vassals and knights, and along with protection. So if someone tries to invade this particular dominion, it's expected that the knights and other engaged in military service will protect the land and the peasants. And another key point and key defining aspect of feudal society is that the ability to move up or down this ladder, but particularly up, is very, very, very limited. These are conceived as kind of being fixed orders, and once you are born into a particular order, that's the general understanding is that's who you're going to be for the rest of your life. So if you're born a serf, you're likely to die as a serf. If you're born a lord, you're likely to remain a lord throughout the entire course of your life. Now, there are some exceptional circumstances where people do move up and down, but in general, where you were born is where you stayed throughout the course of your life. Now, we won't go into each order and what life looked like for them, but we'll just focus a little bit on what life was like for the folks up at the top, so the nobility, aristocracy, and then what life was like for folks down at the bottom. And we'll start with the aristocracy. So in short, life for the aristocracy was pretty good. Now, these folks obviously didn't have the benefits of, say, modern medicine or some of the technology that we do. But in this given society, the people that had the most advantages and privileges and resources were the aristocracy. And just to get a glimpse inside the life of the aristocracy, right now I'm reading War and Peace, the famous novel by Tolstoy. And Tolstoy's family was a member of the Russian aristocracy. So even though War and Peace is a work of fiction, the general portrayals that he gives us of aristocratic life basically correspond to what we see in a kind of actual historical circumstance. And as best as I can tell, with the aristocracy, at least in Russia, because Tolstoy is Russian, what their life was preoccupied by was going to balls, basically fancy parties, the opera, and then gossiping. And I guess you could also include drinking in that as well, because that's what a lot of what they did when they went to these big elaborate parties. And just to give you images of what this looks like. All right, so these are paintings of very famous balls or parties. And the goal here was, I mean, this is all about status. The goal here was to be seen and to be noticed and to be considered important. And so kind of be the center of attention. That was the game, essentially, that they were playing. And one kind of interesting tidbit that comes about and that relates to these kind of balls that were being held, particularly in the Russian context, is you may have heard of Cristal, right? The alcoholic drink. And I have to admit that until recently, I knew it was an alcoholic drink. I knew that it's referenced in a number of songs, like popping bottles of Cristal, but I really had no idea what specifically it was. Well, I learned recently that it's basically sparkling wine, or technically a form of champagne. But the reason why it has the name of Cristal as like a distinct brand is that during the reign of Alexander II, the Tsar Alexander II in Russia, he was very afraid of being assassinated at balls. And one of his fears was that people would put a bomb inside a wine bottle and that would be used to kill him. So he mandated that any form of wine that would be served to him would come in a clear bottle. And the main form of that was Cristal. And so that's kind of the historical origins of um, of that drink, which again is something I didn't know until recently, and I thought was interesting. Now, probably not surprisingly, since these folks have tremendous riches and resources available at their disposal, is that they, at least relative to the times, have a high amount of geographic mobility and also high amounts, again, relative to time, of education. It wouldn't be uncommon for kids in these families to have one or a number of tutors to help them in their education. So it's very, these kids wouldn't go to school, they'd be educated at the home, but with professionals coming in to do that. Um, and so, in the case of, again, from like War and Peace and the Russian aristocracy, they very much wanted to speak French and be fluent French speakers because that was seen as being kind of like the worldwide language of the day. And so they would have many tutors to help them become fluent in French and perhaps other languages, in some cases math, and those kind of things. So life for the aristocracy was pretty good. In contrast, at the bottom of the social scale, we've got the life of peasants or serfs. And some key things to note is that if you are a peasant or a serf, your social life and probably the vast majority of your social existence would be confined to a particular village and the events and things that go on there. And a feudal village would look something like this, right? You'd probably have a manor where the lord lived to supervise things. You'd have people's houses. There'd maybe be couple hundred, maybe 1,000 for some bigger ones, people who would live in a village, but mostly in like the low hundreds. You might have a small church. You'd probably have a pub somewhere. But basically, this would be where you would spend, again, the vast, vast majority of your life in the same physical environment. And this is largely a fact or a function of the fact that for most people, they had very limited geographic mobility. If you're a peasant, you probably didn't have access to a horse. And so what that meant is, and most days you're going to be bound to work in the land, but if you had a day off, the extent that you could travel would basically be how far can you walk away from your village and then get back within, say, a 24-hour period. And so maybe like a 15-mile radius would be like the extent that you travel the world. Also, and I mentioned this before, all right, there's really limited social mobility. So if you're born a peasant and you're born working the fields, that's basically what you're going to do for your entire life. And in terms of your social context, you're basically going to be surrounded by people that you know really well and they know you. Uh, you know all their dirty secrets. They know all your dirty secrets. They're going to share your same language. They're going to share the same religion. They're going to share the same culture. So they're going to know the same songs that you do. They're going to know all the people you know. All right. And basically, you're going to live in a very socially and culturally homogeneous environment. And so, people who are from small towns probably have a sense of this dynamic, right? Where you know everyone and they know you, and you have a whole bunch of shared history. But um, given the communications technology we have and the geographic mobility we have, for as much as small towns kind of speak, at least in some general way, to what life was like in these kind of villages just back at this time, that village, right, that little bubble would basically be your entire world. And in many cases, it'd be your world from when you're born to when you die. And as a result of this, most people had very limited exposure to strangers. And again, strangers could be someone who was from a village or two or three over, not someone who's coming from, different societies and different cultures, halfway across the world. And this might be a little bit different for people who are living on the coasts or in port towns where trade was occurring, because then you might get different people coming in there. But if you lived in just kind of like the middle part of a country, again, the amount of new or quote unquote different people you would encounter over the course of your life would be fairly limited. And so we'll see, like Zimmel brings up this theme, is when we start moving into cities, how is it that we interact with strangers? This was something that people had to figure out, because living in the context of strangers was something that was really, really new, right? Starting with the wide-scale urbanization beginning in the 17 and 1800s. Well, after learning about what life was like in a feudal village, if you think that's something that you would fancy, the good news is there are a few places left where you can have access to this kind of lifestyle. So you can see a few years back, Britain's last remaining feudal village was being sold for a mere £7 million. As you can see, you get 17 working farms. You also get a pub, 10 cottages, 1,800 acres of land. You see that if you buy this, you also get the title of Lord of the Manor. And also, you can see that it has its own court system to settle disputes between farmers and also to impose fines. So obviously, life in this kind of feudal village is not going to be exactly the same as it was back in the day, but you can see kind of some of the remnants of feudalism in this context. Its own private court system, the cottages, the title of lord, and those kind of things. All right, if we look at the economic order of feudalism, point we made before, but it's worth emphasizing, most people work the land, so most people involved in agriculture, farming work. It would look something like this, another painting kind of portraying life at the time. Your time and time in general was controlled by seasons, right? So your daily life would look different in the spring as opposed to the fall, as opposed to summer, as opposed to winter, right? Because the weather would dictate what's going on in terms of planting, harvesting, and those kind of things. Your weekly time would probably be allotted, at least some time would be allotted where you had to work for the Lord. Normally it was like, say, like 2 days a week. You had to work the Lord's lands, and then like 3 or 4 on your own. But the main point here is that people aren't punching a time card. And even though their time is controlled in big ways, in terms of like the actual structure and kind of like in terms of daily activities, it's not highly regulated and controlled. And we'll see when, again, we move over to industrial economy, that changes in some pretty significant ways. So there was also some commercial activity at the time, kind of rudimentary manufacturing, but this was done largely through what's called the putting out system. And basically, what would happen is that merchants would deliver raw materials to people in their villages, and often these were women. They would drop these raw materials off, and then in the evenings, or say in the winter, when people didn't have to work the fields, uh, again, largely women would work on transforming these raw materials into a semi-finished or finished good. And then at some point, the merchant would come back, pick up these finished goods, and then pay the people for the services and what they had produced at this time. And there's still kind of like a colloquial reference to this way of manufacturing goods in the term of cottage industry. You might have heard that term being used. And generally, we kind of refer that as kind of like a small scale enterprise, or one that's just beginning. And that's a reflection of the fact that, again, in this time period, industry, manufacturing, did take place largely in cottages. So, just kind of an interesting historical reference there. All right, and one last topic to address is that in general, during feudal times, most people operated with what's called a traditionalistic orientation toward things. And the main idea here is that people were looking to reproduce the social order as opposed to changing it or innovating, coming up with innovations. So largely the goal was just to reproduce things over and over again. So to make sure that tomorrow looks like it did today, and that things look, 1 year from now, things look like they did today, and a decade out, they look like they do today. So again, reproducing things was preferred over changing them. And again, we can see some examples of this. So occupations were passed down through families, and again, sons would do the work that their fathers did, daughters would do the work that their mothers did, and they would largely do it in the same way. So again, this kind of work passed down through generations. And we can see kind of historical reflections of this in the names that some people have. So the last name Smith is a reference to that was the families that would do blacksmithing, and so they started to be calling Smiths. And in a particular village, the Smiths would be the blacksmiths over generations. It passed down through the family. Same thing with coopers, who are barrel makers, and also carpenters, who were carpenters. And so we live in a time when people are talking about, like, oh, we want to create economic disruption, we want to create these new things and really innovate and do things in a different way. And that was not the case in the feudal times, and not something that people wanted or were in favor of. The general idea and the general goal was just to reproduce things over and over and over again, so have continuity through time. Another reflection of this is that there was really strong norms that regulated major aspects of your individual life. And again, the idea was to kind of create a set of rules that everyone was supposed to follow, and those rules should be followed now, tomorrow, and forever, right? Not a lot of leeway given for people to kind of go out and do their own thing, right? That was just not something that was really tolerated in this time. So an aspect of this, marriage was controlled by the families, not by individuals. So they weren't necessarily kind of like arranged marriages at the time, but definitely your family would be involved in determining who you did or did not get to marry. And concerns of, like, oh, well, I love this person and I want to marry them, were really not given a lot of credence. The question of whether a marriage should take place was, does this make sense for the family in terms of, say, like the land that this would give us access to or the economic benefits that would come from it, not my individual feelings about this other person. And as part of this, there was no real concept of a private life where you, again, kind of like did your own thing and reflected on your individual existence or pursued the things that individually made you happy and made you a distinct person. Again, social life just wasn't really geared for this kind of having this sphere of life and thinking in these terms. Another reflection of this was that there was an attempt to kind of assign everything a place in the social order. And then once you have everything in place once, then to keep everything in place as best as you can and not change things around. So people would be put into families, but for a variety of reasons, sometimes families would fall apart or be disrupted. And if that was the case, say through death and being a widow, the goal was to try to put you back into a different family as quickly as you could, because an individual's place was to be part of a particular family. And if your family went away, either through death of a spouse, death of a parent, then they wanted to put you back into order. So too with apprentices. Sometimes people might be brought in to help with a growing industry or to help work in a particular line of work. And if that was the case, by bringing in an apprentice, you're basically bringing someone who's outside of the family into it. And again, that could be seen as being kind of problematic because we want everything in a place. And so the way to handle that, it'd basically be like you have like a stranger in a particular household. But again, we're getting the sense that feudal orders didn't like strangers. So the way to address that is when an apprentice would be brought into a family, they would effectively be absorbed into that family and be counted and be seen as being part of it. And more generally, strangers were treated with suspicion until they could be assigned a particular place. So if they could be brought into a family, then they would be okay. But if you're just kind of like a wanderer and you don't have a assigned place in a particular society or a particular social order, you were really treated with suspicion and skepticism and ostracism. All right, that's kind of our introduction to kind of feudal order and what feudal society looked like. Then what we'll do in class is we'll talk about the changes that we see as a result of changes in industry, changes in political system, and then changes in terms of thinking, such as the Enlightenment.